Side quests have been a thing in RPGs prior to the days of RPGs being in video game form, and by that token, no explanation of what these are should really be needed upon starting this video. But I'm gonna go ahead and explain exactly how side quests work anyway, so I can reference this material later on. Essentially, if we plot the main story in a linear chart like this, considering the story is linear, and indicate the main story beats with these dots here, then side quests are the things that happen adjacent to these. Some side quests can only be done between 2 points in the story. Many only become available after certain points and can be completed right up until the end, while others can span the entire length of the game or even go beyond the main story's end credits. At any point you may see one or several of them available, and in rare instances side quests may intersect with the main story to create situational variations. But they should never be required to complete a game. A side quest that is required to beat the game is still a main quest. You just might not always have to complete it in the same fashion or with the same sense of urgency you'd complete your other main story quests in. Ni no Kuni 2's Kingdom Building quest is a great example of this sort of thing. In Ni no Kuni 2, you're given a kingdom to build up throughout the course of the game, as a sort of side project you do adjacent to the main plot. And though it seems optional at first, there does come a point where it's revealed to the player that in order to beat the game, the kingdom needs to be built up to a certain level. So although you may have been working on it adjacent to the main story quest, it wasn't adjacent at all and is itself a main story quest. This is the general set of affairs when it comes to side quest implementation. Such has and seems to remain the case today. However, following the release of Final Fantasy XVI, discourse arose about side quests in RPGs once again, and this game was singled out among fans and detractors alike for having poor side quests. As I played through the game, I couldn't help but feel that, while in most ways the side quests were actually above average for the genre, people were still right. And it left me wondering, have side quests in RPGs really lost their way? And the short answer is, kind of, yeah, they have. But if that's true, then how did we get here, with a game whose side quests are mostly above average, getting lampooned by most players as being poor? Well, let's start by going back in time a little bit. When RPGs were in their heyday, the golden era, side quests were handled a fair bit differently. Often games had very few of them, but were remembered fondly despite this due to the unique challenges they posed, the gear and loot they provided as a reward, or the lore they added along the way. Further, many RPGs from this era would build out entirely different forms of challenges for their side quests. Once upon a time, extreme sports were kind of a recurring gimmick for side quests, or even obstacle courses, races, timed button press minigames, and high score challenges. These days, these things are incredibly rare. We've seen it return a little bit in Final Fantasy VII R, but this was likely an undertaking they done only because the groundwork and expectation was already there, and the absence of these things would be felt strongly among the fans. The only franchise I think is doing a great job providing a ton of side quests with lots of variety these days are the Yakuza and Judgment games. In the years since these things were normal, and as we progressed into the world of HD games, budgets had ballooned astronomically, leaving very little in the way for additional R&D for unique side quest building. Further, RPGs gradually dropped out of the limelight, and so budgets were shrunk to closer match sales projections. But the truth of these things does nothing to dissuade what fans of the genre want, and their wants, by and large, only grew bigger over time. RPGs had a reputation for their length and sheer volume of content they provided. RPGs were expected to have 40 hours of main story content, often with another 40 hours of content on the side. Developers, of course, would do what they could to meet the demand halfway, but that's just the thing. It was halfway. For a long stretch of time, side quests in RPGs would become repeats of what the main story already offered, but maybe with an extra piece of gear as a reward. You revisit old locations, talk to old NPCs, defeat super-powered reskins of bosses you fought earlier. Most quests would be built using only what the game already provided. This resulted in side quests generally only having a handful of different objectives. Talk to this person, deliver that item, collect X amount of something, or kill a certain enemy. However, the biggest insult to side quest design would come in the form of job boards, where unseen NPCs could request things for you to gather or kill for them. Job boards would often offer a little bit of flavor text that nobody ever reads, and would serve very little purpose outside of bonus XP for completing quests you picked up without ever looking at them. But these too helped balloon the total completion time of a game, which looks great in marketing. And if there's one genre where runtime is talked up, it's the JRPG. Fans of this genre love to brag about how long they played a game for, and devs target them as much as anybody else. This has been the state of side quests for a long time, with the exception of a few franchises that handle it differently. But of course, as time moved on, this also caused complaints. And why wouldn't it? Players wanted deep side quests, but they also wanted a lot of them. And why wouldn't they, right? Those big open world games were already offering something similar, so why couldn't we get that in our story-driven JRPGs? So Final Fantasy XVI released and provided just that. A ton of side quests that had depth. Every side quest in the game, save for the notorious Mark monster hunts, feature unique NPCs with defined characters and motives. Most side quests involve multiple quest objectives and build out the world in ways as meaningful as your interest for the NPCs that inhabit it. So why did people feel so strongly about them? Well, there was the aforementioned variety issue. This sort of thing wasn't addressed at all. What you do to complete side quests is what you do to complete anything else in the game. Most side quests as well offered very poor rewards outside of the XP and money gains. Final Fantasy XVI didn't contain enough gear, armor, or special abilities to fill out this many side quests. And as a really weak remedy, a crafting system of sorts was tacked onto the game. You could get some unique crafting parts to build weapons with at the blacksmith, but more than likely you'd see yourself getting your 1400th magic ash or something. A crafting component you probably can't even use that much of in an entire playthrough. But as a Yakuza fan, I'd say a good story could help me look past all of these things. All I need is to enjoy the stories the same as I do the sub-stories in Yakuza. And for the most part, I do, but there's a massive structural issue that makes side quests drag. It's not too apparent early on in Final Fantasy XVI, where there's very few side quests to choose from. But as the game opens up more, and especially as you close in on the end, they start giving you handfuls of side quests at a time, and it becomes almost absurd. Even the shorter side quests are built to be as time-consuming as possible. Final Fantasy XVI may have listened to the audience's desire for richer side quests, but they went way too far with it, over-detailing every interaction with seemingly endless dialogue over mundane things. In tandem, they also stretched side quests out to have far more quest objectives than necessary. Before I rolled credits on the game with less than 10 side quests left for 100% completion, I gave up on them. They weren't worth the annoyance. One clear example of this structural issue came in a quest where a chef in the hideout wanted to make a meal from an ancient recipe, a recipe whose ingredient names have changed over the years. To understand what the ingredients they're looking for are, you need to talk to a man named Tomes. And Tomes stands a whopping 40 feet away from the person who gives you the quest. She could have asked herself. It may sound like a small thing to complain about, but bitch work like this really adds up and gets really annoying. There was no reason they couldn't have made her have this conversation with Tomes before the quest began, then just have her tell Clive what the results of that conversation were before sending him off. Clive, and by extension the player, doesn't need to be present for every detail discovered along the way. And things like this only compound further later on. The quest line under new management gets really egregious with this as well. If ever there was a quest that over-objectived itself, it's this. And yes, that's a term I just made up. There's probably a better word for it, but I'm gonna say over-objective. To start, you talk to a lady in town who wants to more or less survey the opinions of the townfolk. After you clear her objective marker, 3 more pop up around the town. So you travel back and forth to your 3 new objective markers talking to the townsfolk. And when you finally complete that, Clive has the brilliant idea to survey 3 more people around town to gauge people of different perspectives. A noble and even agreeable cause, but again, it's bitch work. Motherfucker, just give me a montage. 6 silent shots across 6 seconds. Then place me back at the woman who gave me the task and have Clive regurgitate his detail discoveries to her. So yeah, we have detail-rich side quests, many of which have great stories, but the quest objectives are often bloated in their method of giving you those details. Bloated as well is the travel time required for them. Travel time made only more bothersome by the game's lack of traversal mechanics. Unique quest objectives do not exist in Final Fantasy XVI, and the rewards are poor. The worst part though is what I said earlier. This is above average for the genre these days. It's rare an RPG lets you do anything that you don't normally do in the main story quests. I know I'm using Final Fantasy XVI as an example of side quests being done poorly, as that's the discourse right now, but it's just the latest in a long line of games that don't stick the landing here, though it does stick it better than most. It's just a different set of issues than usual is really highlighted here. So the question is, how do we remedy remedy this? Well, there's a number of places to start. The first thing I'd recommend is to cut the amount of side quests down dramatically and structure them differently as to not bloat the runtime. If they kept only a third of these quests, they could invest in more interesting side games, things that probably wouldn't even take that much effort to build. A Chocobo racing game, for instance. No, a real one. New tracks could be unlocked after different story points. The more open map areas can be transformed to contain a course to race on. Hell, I would love something like a simple button mashing minigame where we take Byron out to the game's various pubs and arm wrestle some ne'er-do-wells to restore order. Some sort of archery minigame similar to the Legend of Zelda's game houses would be easy as well. Half the mechanics already exist in the game. It would be a stone's throw away from repurposing content for new quests. There is a lot that could be done to add variety here. The rewards also would need to be overhauled. Crafting was the game's short answer to reward giving, and it always felt completely unrewarding to get crafting materials. But what if the hideout that we spend most of the game in was a little less complete when we found it, and we could craft optional extensions to it? 1,400 pieces of lumber would feel a lot more justified than 1,400 pieces of magic ash. If they were to keep all the quests the way they were, I think there was still more they could do to improve it. I would say remove half the markers from the maps. Let players find these quests on their own. There's a magic to discovery, to finding things on your own, a magic that could justify actually talking to the NPCs and exploring these open zones that feel largely empty otherwise. The way it's presented now feels like a checklist. Players, however, do pay attention to checklists, and they keep their own mental one they don't like to leave incomplete. And yes, a bit of onus is on the players too. You could just not do the side quests if you don't find them good. But it can be hard to get into the mentality of ignoring stuff like this that's literally staring you in the face. Or figuratively. Most people know they can ignore a side quest, but what if some of this content we actually see is actually great? The only way to sort through them is to do them yourself or read a guide and risk spoilers. So I would say, hide the content, or at least hide a lot of it, any of the ones that don't have a plus sign. This would solve so many problems and give the players a sense of wonder when exploring the world and actually finding shit. But player mentality problems, of course, go beyond this. Players seem to only ask devs for more and more, and for what's being given to them to only ever increase in quality ad infinitum. But I don't think it'd be off base to say a compromise is overdue. Not every game, not even RPGs, need to contain 50 to 200 hours of content. I'm okay with shorter games and less content. I'm double okay with it if the content is more varied and interesting and rewarding. To some, this will sound antithetical to the genre, but content bloat is pretty out of control, and the more bloated the shit becomes, the more corners need to be cut to bloat it. I would rather it take 35 hours to 100% Final Fantasy XVI than 50 hours to do it in its current state. Besides, think back on a lot of the RPGs you loved most with the side quests that left the biggest impressions on you growing up. Compare them one-to-one with Final Fantasy XVI. Chances are, a lot of them don't stack up in terms of depth, lore, or quality of writing. But there was something else there, right? A unique challenge, a sense of discovery, good loot, or even just a heightened sense of importance because those games were so sparing with their side quests that they actually came off as feeling like something special. All of these things are harder to pull off when the entire system is as bloated as it's become. Of course, as stated before, rare exceptions exist. Witcher 3 and Yakuza scale the summit with gusto, but there will likely never be a day where these aren't exceptions. And we kind of need to become okay with that and encourage devs to take their side quests in a different direction. One that doesn't require debilitating bloat or out of control budgets that'll never break even. Until then, RPGs have a side quest problem, but it's not entirely self-made. Developers who are answering to player demands are between a rock and a hard place. And even in the best attempts to meet player demands halfway, we all come up unhappy. But I'd also hazard to say players often don't understand what they're asking for or even really know the ramifications of what these requests would be. Maybe I don't either, but I think it's time we all reevaluate what we're asking for and what we really truly want. And I'd say it's time devs reevaluate what they're listening to and how to proceed going forward.